got a hint to get going? Hi, Michael. We good, Destiny? We're good to go? We have everybody?
Sitting chair.
Okay.
He's over in Scotland.
Oh, that's right. Okay, welcome to our work meeting for Wednesday, May 10th. Busy agenda, so we'll just get right into it. Review of this evening's agenda. Any modifications, comments?
If I might make a suggestion that we move item 2.2 to after 2.4, so we just push that budgeted, let's get rid of those earlier things. I think the
So
1, 2, 3, and 2, 4 will go a little faster.
if I might, the reason we put them behind the budget is I actually think you're gonna talk about, you can talk about them all, but they all have budget implications. We thought you can move them if you want, but I'd hate for you to do this and then we go to a budget and you say, oh wait, why did we just spend all this time talking about spending money? So it's up to council, but we put them that way on purpose because they thought the budget would inform.
I don't know, but that's good.
Okay,
We're completely open to moving them. That was our rationale.
fine. We'll leave them after and then they'll be even more.
Also note that Councilmember Hodges is not with us. He's in Scotland, so he won't be joining us, and Councilmember Orrin will be joining us after water board meeting, so just noted that, but we still have our quorum. 1.2 future agenda items, anything?
OHV.
Okay.
Yeah.
Specifically, we need to talk about what's going on and how it sounds like council needs to give direction on how we want that to proceed.
And FOH doesn't want to involve OHV in their trails and committees. They're like, we can't help you.
Which, I mean, I don't wanna get into this is for that conversation, but I understand where they're coming from.
But that doesn't mean that OHV still doesn't need to be something that we're trying to advocate for and find solutions to.
That's what I told Sherry too, exactly what I told Sherry, maybe this, I kind of put that in the email, I don't hesitate to create a precedent, but at the same time, until we find the area for OHV, I think that's on us to work with Dwayne and his group.
Yeah.
That's on us to work. So I understand both sides, I guess, in this situation, so. But yeah, we can discuss
So
it.
we need to stay on that and give some clear direction. His work, 'cause it's not just him, it's his organization, his statewide organization, to try to open up areas.
Okay. Any other future agenda items?
Firework restriction map.
Oh.
I'm good with-
Sometime.
I'm good with consent.
Yeah. I forgot to reply to that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Steve,
For what,
good
sorry?
with the firework map just being on consent agenda?
Yes.
Okay. 1.3, council discussion of future citizen recognition.
Yes, I've got one. I'm gonna reach out and try and coordinate something with them, but, got a report yesterday of a local ward was doing, an activity day with their, young men. So these kids are 9 and 10, maybe 11, and there's a whole group of them. And they were gonna go up to the, reservoir and pick up some garbage. Only 2 boys showed up, and they spent like over an hour walking around, just these 2 boys, and cleaned up all this garbage all the way around the reservoir, did all this great work.
Wow.
And so I just wanted to applaud them and their leaders for going out and doing that. I thought that was just, it's easy if there's 20 kids that show up, right? But when it's only 2 and they spend all that time doing it themselves, that was pretty cool. So somebody sent me that picture and told me about them, so I got all their names. I'll reach out and see if I can bring them up, so.
Okay.
If we can do it next meeting, fine. If not, do it one after, so.
Okay. Anything, Jerry? I have reached out to, I think you guys were all in on the email, that landscaper.
Oh,
that witnessed his neighbor. I did get a message from the neighbor, the neighbor that sent us the email reached out to me and let me know they would be on hospice, so he probably, but still, they feel like nothing else. His life-saving measures allowed his wife to at least probably, you know, say goodbye, some family to say goodbye, so he's probably not gonna make it, but I still wanna bring this one out and
Yeah, wow.
his, you know, his employers should, as a matter of fact, it's kind of, we'll talk about it more, but it was a miracle he was there, cause they'd done all the work in the fall, and just came back just to basically start the sprinklers up for this elderly couple, not even technically scheduled to be there at that time, just happened to be there. This, so, I'm working with his employer to find a way.
Wow.
For them to be here, so.
That's awesome.
So, yeah. Okay, move on to 2.1, discussion regarding changes to the city council rules of procedure. Nathan?
So, there, not too long ago at a meeting, you just asked us to look specifically at, two items, to keep this pretty limited. How you respond to public comment, or what you can do during the public comment portion of a hearing. And then there was a question about abstentions. So if you go to that policy on page 4, we addressed the public comment and simply added which you probably would have had anyways, but it's just not clearly spelled out, the ability to ask questions to staff or to the citizen. The danger here is you don't want to get in a back and forth or an argument or
A debate.
a debate, or between staff and the citizen through the council. But this is designed so that you can ask those questions, so you don't have to sit there and say, I can't respond, I can't ask. But really, the thing you want to avoid is a debate. But if you have a legitimate question, you should be able to
You
ask
can't
that.
make decisions and resolve their issue they came in with. Ask some questions and take notes and follow up with you, or have someone follow up with you.
So that's that change. And then on 5, we just added your current, the way it's currently written, if you abstain for any reason, it's a no vote. But I think if you have a legitimate financial conflict of interest and you're saying, I'm not participating at all, it should not be a vote at all, so that's.
If you have questions, if it is a conflict of interest, let me know. More oftentimes, there might be a perceived conflict of interest when there's actually not a conflict of interest. And you can state your perceived conflict of interest on the record, to kind of let people know where you're at. But if you abstain in that type of scenario, it'd be a no vote rather than a true actual conflict.
So actually, there's an actual, so if you talk to the attorney and say, yes, this is my business about to enter into a contract with the city, probably should not be voting.
So definitions maybe help that. The big difference between abstaining, which is saying I don't want to vote on this for whatever reason, right? That's just, I just don't want to. Whatever your reason is, that's what it means, right? So that's a no, but you're not saying no. And conflict of interest is, I stand to benefit financially from this, I can't vote on it because of it.
Well, and
So we called it recuse.
I shouldn't say financially, directly benefit.
yeah, and as we talked about during the training, Utah law does not clarify that if you have an actual conflict of interest that you have to abstain. You could still vote on it if you wanted to, but it makes sense if you do that you recuse yourself and it goes to.
That's the difference with abstain versus recuse.
Recusal, yeah.
So we just put that in there so that it's easier for council to do that. Like I said, you'd hate to abstain and then it gets counted as no, and somebody said, well, you were voting on it. No, usually if you're voting against, it's not a big deal, but
The one thing I would say about that is that it says actual financial conflict of interest.
you can strike.
I would strike financial, because I think that there are other, it could be for a family member, it could be for whatever reasons that you would wanna recuse yourself from a vote there.
And generally those also then come back to some sort of financial or pecuniary, but you could see that if you were appointing somebody to a committee that was a family member, you wouldn't want to. I can see that. So we can just, if that's it, when we bring it back, I'll just strike that.
Yeah, I just don't want it to, I don't want the requirement to be some kind of financial reason. If a member of the council feels that they should recuse themselves from a vote, we should allow them that latitude to do so, right? For whatever objections they choose to.
So Utah code states specifically that it's for a financial interest, when you declare your conflict. And there's a process in doing that. If it's not a financial conflict of interest under Utah code, then there is no conflict. Let me give you an example that came up.
And that would be where the abstention,
Yeah,
right, and you can state why, but, but for like where I've seen it, gosh, it sucks that I've seen some of this stuff now, it says here years, but it's, a lot of times, that's why I wanna recuse myself from this, when they really just don't wanna go on the record with their vote for or against, and it should be an abstain. And then from a legal point of view, if there's financial pecuniary gain, right, then that's actionable, right? It's much harder to prove.
Nepotism or something,
Yeah,
right, I
right.
got it, okay.
and
Fair
I'll
enough.
give you an example where it seemed like there was a conflict of interest where there wasn't. In Bluffdale, there was a council member who's a realtor, and there was a project that came through, and this certain firm was representing the seller or the buyer. She was a part of the Keller William entity, but not associated with the sale, not even a part of that office. As you know, there's a whole bunch of subgroups. And she didn't declare a conflict of interest because she wasn't a part of it at all. She didn't even know that this was even a thing, but that's where the argument, she did not receive any financial interest, therefore she did not have to declare a conflict of interest. Even though, again, there's always perceived conflict of interest, but those aren't they don't meet the statutory requirements.
So
I would
I
say-
could abstain
It's
from
interesting.
that, cause there is a connection and I'm not comfortable with it.
But
I
then
can't
it's a no
necessarily
vote, yeah.
recuse myself.
Yeah, understood.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
fair enough.
I think it is good public policy, if there's a perception, to at least discuss it, and if your counterparts are fine, again, if there's no value, in that instance, that example, if you just disclose it, at least you're upfront about it, there's no interest, and then, because there's always somebody who's going to question motives, if there's a perception, so.
It's interesting, you either have to. Yeah, you have to take a vote on it no matter what, even if you have a conflict of interest, you have to vote.
Like I said, if it's a true financial, then the recusal is an opportunity there.
But you should go on the record and say this is the situation and
Right.
whatnot.
And you could even state that this doesn't meet the elements of a conflict of interest, but like Nathan's saying, yeah, I do wanna bring up that
There's a perception,
yeah, there's a
yeah.
perception that this is there. And then that way the public knows where you're at. You still might get criticisms, like I pointed out with the planning commissioner and Sandy, who got criticized for putting a development application forward. That happened to be a part of the Olympia group. But, so you're not always gonna win, but at least you're being upfront. And I
To be
think,
fair, it was a landscape architect that was working.
Yeah.
Well, project.
Right.
Still a great example, I
Fair.
loved it.
It was just appropriate to say for that.
It was a good.
Okay, so we're okay keeping financial then, to meet
Yeah, that's fine,
Okay.
yep. Alright.
Okay,
I will bring that forward.
I keep going back into consent.
That's what I was planning.
Okay.
So,
Okay,
Well, I do have one question about that, just real quick, sorry.
it's fine, I'm not in your hurry to move on.
In
next
the,
item.
in the issues with, when it comes to, public hearings. Okay, so there's public comment, there's public hearings, right? With a public hearing, the comment from residents is held at exactly the same time as the item is being discussed on the agenda, right? When we have public comment about something that's being done, they have 2 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, and an hour and a half later, an applicant can come up and make a presentation that takes 15 or 20 minutes, and there's no chance for any resident to come up and make any points, make any rebuttals, have any any discussion about it. They have to make their comments before the presentation is even heard. And that continues to be a point that I dislike about how our meetings go.
Well, that's a good point, but only if we choose to close the public comment, right? We can keep it open and close it later.
Yeah, I believe correct me if I'm wrong, in most places, council has the right to take public comment on any item they want. So at that time, if it's a big enough item, I think good public policy is to try and keep those comments tied to it at that time.
I would agree.
So it's, often, if the presentation's a good one, it may answer their questions.
Sure.
Sometimes it will spur other ones that they may wanna get up. So I think that's kind of up to you. When I look through these rules, it really doesn't distinguish between a hearing and public comment, which is why I put them there. There may be some state rules on what a hearing, as you start to move into some of the, quasi judicial, I don't know how much we do of that here. But I think.
Public hearing has all these steps and formalities and
Yeah,
da, da,
so
da, you know.
as I'm thinking through that, right, it's just process, so public hearing is different than public comment, right? So public hearing on that particular item, anyone can raise their hand and come and make whatever comment they want, tell us that we're, you know, I don't know, let's talk about the queen if they want to. They make whatever comment they want, that's the public hearing, right? We can close the public hearing, have the presentation, then we discuss amongst ourselves, we have questions, we ask staff to come up and answer those questions. If we wanted to, there's nothing preventing us from, as I've taken notes from all of those people that made comments, this guy had this question, I'm asking that question of staff, I'm not sure it got answered, can I call Mr. Jones up and ask him, this was the question you asked, this is the answer you got, can we do that, call them, right? So, but they can't just raise their hand and say, I wanna come and talk again.
Yeah, my question is, can we clarify and make sure that we all understand and try to accommodate things like that, especially when it is a important or contentious or serious issue, when you've got an audience full of people that are there to talk about a specific item and they have to make their comments before that item's even heard, it disenfranchises people from a conversation about the issue.
Yeah, and public comment, generally, the piece at the beginning are for things that
In general,
generally they're not on the agenda, they're bringing it to you.
Sure,
Again, good public policy, when I started my career, everybody put public comment at the end. Mostly because then everybody was tired after a 3-hour meeting and nobody stayed around. So everybody started moving, it needs to be at the front of the meeting, so if there's an item. But I think council has that ability, so you have public hearings, it's very structured. If you have an item that's just up for discussion, but it triggers, and there are people there who wanna talk about it, I believe you have, as a group.
But what
can
if it's
vote,
up for
Let's go
action?
ahead, well, it could be, and you say, let us go ahead and, let's take comment, if there are people who want to make comment, you as council could,
I'm getting word from our expert.
that's where I'm
that we
worried about
have-
is
It's
we're,
at the discretion of the chair, so we can do this at any point.
Okay.
So that's kind of what I'm saying is that we could.
we're not violating any applicant's rights by holding a public,
What you run the risk of though
Comment
is when you
section.
have a room full of people is then it can never end.
Yeah, I was
And
gonna say, it could go back and forth and back and forth.
yeah,
How do
you
end
get the back
cycle?
and forth, so I get what you're saying, and
No, no,
this is where I
I
began
still
in
think
all
you
of
have the
this.
2 minutes, I still think you limit the comment time, I still think I totally
Presentation
get
or
that's appropriate,
questions,
right.
but then it's a question of if there's people that have, and this is where I've always been and where I started out organizing community groups, right? Is you take the time to come down, you're interested in it, you've done your homework,
Right.
and it's frustrating, you only get that 2 minutes and then they have this discussion to make their decision and we didn't get to rebut anything or ask follow-up questions, cause now information was presented that we didn't have before.
Exactly, that's
Right?
the issue, right?
And if we have an organized group or a large group that's taken the time to come out, do we wanna give them the chance to then ask follow-up questions? Don't necessarily want to get into a debate back and forth and have them say this guy's full of garbage and he's self-interested and all those things. We want constructive questions, right? And
I think
follow
that's something as chair
those
you
sorts of
can
things.
coach through that, like, this is,
Absolutely.
we're gonna open up a public comment time. The same rules are gonna apply, we
Any
want.
follow-up
right,
questions,
da-da-da.
not-
It's a time to,
Yes.
but remember, you're addressing your questions to the
To us,
council,
not
not to
them,
the
right.
applicant, right, you know, that kind of stuff.
and it, in my experience, most of the time, that's after staff's given whatever presentation. So in a public hearing, we have a structure of who speaks when, and you follow that. And if somebody brings a question, you wanna ask a question, you do exactly as Councilor Henderson said, you call if it's not scheduled for a public hearing, right, it's just a regular item on here, there's no,
Say tonight, Laguna Malibu.
somebody wants to talk, it's not scheduled for a public hearing, but they're raising a hand, maybe it's the parks ordinance, right, they wanna talk to you about this parks ordinance. I don't think after the staff presentation, there's anything that limits you to say, okay, there's individuals who would like to speak to it. And if they turn in their form ahead of time and say, well, Lynn, why don't you, now you've had this presentation, come up and ask your questions or make your comment, and now you've had the benefit of that in a more timely, instead of an hour earlier, I don't remember, what did they say?
I like that.
Okay.
That's always at your discretion, so we give you rules, they guide you when you're having certain ones you want to follow that structure, cause it also protects you, but you do have discretion, so don't feel like you're trapped.
It's just tough once you get into that situation of keeping control of it.
The one thing that you will need to consider too are, when you reopen things, that you're giving everyone the same opportunity. Cause you don't wanna say, have discrimination on their First Amendment. So, if you open it up to all, you give them the same parameters, the 2 minutes. And then you try not to deviate from that unless you're asking follow-up questions, and those should be extremely limited.
Thank you, everybody. I just think that's important, and I appreciate the opportunity to add that into our discussion. I think it allows the public to be more engaged and involved and have their voices heard on the items that are important to
Well,
them.
there's nothing more discouraging than trying to be involved and be told basically
Yeah.
you can't be.
Right, and then sitting on the sidelines. People get so frustrated with the process. I myself have been frustrated with that process, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, move on to item 2.2, budget discussion.
Really, tonight, we downloaded a bunch of data to you last, is that just last week?
Thursday.
Last Thursday, and I turned it to you ago. And so I do have a few slides if the questions go this way. I won't make you endure it unless you want. It's about the capital planning, how we do that. We're here really to hear your questions. We have answers, we'll give them to you, otherwise we'll bring them back. This is also scheduled for the next meeting. But we do just kind of that high level, we have deficits as it's currently planned with some monies moving around and what we perceive to be an economic slowdown coming. In the general fund, in police, water, pretty much anywhere we have employees, we discovered. We've made some changes internally since then. We're making some changes with our insurance that will cover a pretty significant part of that. Our recommendation, as we left in the last presentation, was not to hire those positions that were in the 24 budget, which has already been adopted. We would just hold those vacant. In the general fund, that's about $500,000. Looking at Kyle.
Right.
It's about that much, so we would kind of sit on that and wait and see. Eco Northwest did a study for the league. I don't know how many of you read that in their newsletter when it came out, but it shows Harriman, projects Harriman to have a 2.8% decrease in sales tax next year. That said, they kept our population flat, and that's not realistic either, so I think we're probably gonna push, but we are trying to be very conservative on that piece. Our recommendation again was probably pushing some of the capital, spreading that out. When we did our capital plan, we had a number we thought was sustainable. It's turned out not probably to be the case based on what we're seeing, and then also just, I think some of the assumptions were just overly aggressive. So I think we have that right-sized now. Ultimately, I'd like to have a model that we could just play with in here. You said, what if we do this? Right now, it's a brute force one. I think we'd have to, if you make a change, it spends a couple hours to get it because the links were all broken. We'll got a plan to get that fixed.
So do we wanna kind of take this one by one, like one general fund, police,
Yeah, well, I think if there's specific questions counselors have, we can handle it. If you wanna do it by fund, I think we're open either way. I don't know if this works.
I think it might also be helpful to give you some numbers, so
Yeah,
based off of the last discussion we had, I did go ahead and run the numbers if we take out the new positions that were added. In addition, we had discussed, we have some vacant positions that are currently under recruitment. Mainly the accountant is the main one, and there's some intern positions. With those being taken out and then the insurance adjustments, since we finally got numbers back, so that leaves the general fund at about $1 million in deficit. It leaves the police at roughly $550 in deficit.
so one of the things, and so that's actually, I'll talk about this in the capital plan, so Kyle had those charts last time where it's whatever we had left is what we put into capital. So that's traditionally been Harriman's approach, which means you do it on the fly as you go. And I think some of you talked about, you'd see a spreadsheet, you'd pick some projects, and the next year you'd see another spreadsheet, but the projects that were on last year's spreadsheet that you didn't fund, you don't know what happened to them, they're just not there any longer. So we're trying to take up a plan. So they'll say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So how do we plan and commit a certain funding level to do this? So the first thing is we have all these master plans. We have to figure out how we integrate those master plans into a capital plan. And then that then informs the budget, but the budget has a feedback loop that says this is how much money you actually have. And so you have to push some things and spread. And that's what we're talking about, is how do you balance and maybe push projects out a little bit further. Nobody likes that, but that's what it is. A challenge we have here is this new development charges forward. They may be building things in our master plan, but we hadn't planned to get to them yet. We have, in some instances, they're eligible for impact fees. In many instances, they are not. These are system upgrades that we would eventually get to, but development is kind of moving us and making some budgetary decisions if you choose to do it at that time. That is unique, given our current circumstance. And then we have a bunch of reimbursement agreements. I think they're all there. Fingers crossed. We have been trying to capture all of those and put those actually in the plan, because we've already committed to spend money. So whether it's impact fees or in the general fund, in our capital planning, we've included those. Those are not really ones we get to cut, because even if they're 4 and 5 year old agreements, they're contracts that we've signed. So we're trying to capture those so that we don't spend the money twice. I think in the past, I know at least in one, we've committed the same funds more than once. So we're trying to fix that. How do we go that forward? So that's really kind of where capital, so when I talk about this isn't as much a structural as that we need to readjust how we do our capital. This is the way it looks right now. And this is probably just not a realistic number. This big jump right here is the Public Works building. And if we can build it for 12 million, I say do it. That's what's in the CIP, but I don't think that's a realistic number. So these are kind of the big funds we've been talking about. Next one, this just is all the funds. Public safety, this is there. If I could again build a police building for that price, I would do it. I don't think that's realistic. So these were plans that were put together. It's the way it's working right now. We need to go through and refine it. When I look at just in 2024, and so this is I will take the blame for this. I assumed certain things. I needed to bring the staff along a little bit more. That in a budget that's already there, we can't add things. So this is one that was driven by development. It's on a master plan. We don't have the funds for it. It was not in the capital planning when we adopted the 24 budget. But that project's moving forward, and so they stuck it in here. Staff did. I've talked to them. You can't really do that. You can't add a project into a budget that's already adopted. If you add it, you're taking a like-sized project and moving it back. Right? Council could do it if they want, but you've got to take something of the similar magnitude and move it if this is a plan. This one right here is actually a duplicate. this was a reimbursement number that we thought we'd do, but it actually shows up under a CDA for the full reimbursement, so that one we'll just have to take out. This is one that's driven by something UDOT's doing. So it's not unusual to get stuff that pops up, hey, we're doing this, you need to pay to future-proof your utilities and things like that. So things come out of our control that where you might stick it in, but again, this is, since it's only 34,000. This one I think was just, they're in the, so my staff knows. I usually download things and give them a date and save them, so I know when they change later. We didn't have any playground stuff in the original one that we built the budgets off of. So I think now there are several different playgrounds that are scheduled to be replaced. But this one got added in 24, probably should be 25. I'm not sure how we got away with that name. Where?
Over in Rosecrest and the Ranches area.
Some of the original park structures that
The
were
red,
in.
yellow, and blue stuff that you see.
Yeah, there. And then this one, I just put this in there. This is funded by operations, and so when we've talked about cutting, we've left your asphalt maintenance in there. So we haven't talked about taking that out. So even when we said, when I told you it was structural and I removed all the capital, I didn't remove the, just to see what happened. I didn't change the asphalt maintenance and I didn't remove our obligations such as reimbursement agreements. So it really is how many projects can we do realistically in a year. Again, if you look at 2025, you start to see, if you wanted to bring that sewer line in, well, you could do this, except this is also a reimbursement that was signed 3 or 4 years ago. They're just finally getting to it. We need to pay that. Again, that's that duplicate. This is the 6,400 that comes into Olympia. We've agreed to, we're under obligation to pay part of it. Bike lanes were in there. This is the beginning of the 6,000 West. This is design. This is where you're starting to buy properties and do some actual work. So those are the kind of projects often what we're gonna have to do is look at and say, okay, this is funded by a grant, but this is the general funds portion, so there's a lot to be talking about, but my recommendation is in 2024 is that we push some things out. Again, the project, the biggest project, if we're running $1 million deficit, we're spending $3 million on 7,300 West widening. We're gonna have to spend that at some point. I think we're actually heading into a good bidding time, so it's probably not a bad time to do it, but this would be that one time, so. Sherry's not here to defend it, but I don't wanna recommend moving it. Some of these may move out, and in that third year, sometimes a project will sit in the third year of a capital plan for much more than 3 years, because you can't figure out exactly the funding. It needs to be one of the next ones up. It's just a big project to kind of get your arms around. So it'll stay in that year 3, 4, 5 for a while before it moves into the actual funded, but it keeps it on the radar so you don't forget about it. And then you can plan, finance can try and plan to do it. If it's a really big project, you may be bonding for it, but that's the purpose of this capital planning. And I could bring up and show you the whole thing. It goes on for pages, which is why I did not print it or try to put it up here. But these are the ones that are happening in the general fund in the next few years that I think we have to do, but we may want to push some of them out. Like, this would be nice to have. I would say that's one of your first projects that you slide out. Baseball people will hate my guts, but it wasn't in the original one either. It is in 2025. This one can go away, you may push some of these. We can bring you back.
Let me ask just one question about the projections for 2025 and beyond, probably even 2024. How many of those are those projections in today's dollars, or are those today's dollars plus inflationary estimates?
So the CPI should be, or the CIP should be inflated dollars, depending, so they establish it today and then they should use an inflation. And I know Kyle does that on,
I do on my 10-year projections, however, I'm not involved with the CIP, so I don't know.
so I'm assuming
how
that's what we're
establishing
doing,
their
so I don't know if it's.
So, so originally, if you plan it in 2025, yes, the inflation is built for 3 years out, but as soon as you push it to 2027,
Yeah, it's gonna be more.
there's no inflation adjustment to that, right? It's just
That
getting
amount will
pushed
go
with
up,
that
yeah.
value, so there should be a second inflation added, but it was just
And when you move it out like that, you do have to add that inflation, that's a good point.
Yeah.
But we should be building them out in a few years with an estimated inflation value, so if we'd done this a few years ago with inflation that shot through the roof, they're probably all a little lower.
Sure, and it's imperfect because you're projecting, but, when it says, 1.8 million, is that 1.8 million in today's dollars, or is that 1.8 million in 2025?
Well, this is done by an engineer, cause I wouldn't have projected that. I
Almost
would have rounded that up to
always
one
what
point
you're-
nine, but that's okay.
Almost always what you're seeing is today's dollars. I mean, it's hard to say
Well,
otherwise.
that's what I'm asking, because if we're already budgeting behind, we should
So,
be fixing that.
so what we're saying is, we project this and then we put an inflation factor and move it out 3 years. So it's actually, if we did it today, we think it would be a little less than this, but we're guessing on what that inflation.
Yeah, that's what I guess that's what I wanna make absolutely certain of, is that 1.894, if we did it today, would be 1.7.
It would
But
be
because
less
it's
than
in 2025, it's
Right.
1.894, and that's what I wanna be certain of, because if we're this'll get into maybe a broader philosophical discussion that I think we as a council need to have so we can offer proper direction. But if we are forecasting budget surpluses or shortages, and they're based off of numbers that aren't correct, we're just setting ourselves up for more problems down the road, and we're making decisions today that that are gonna reap negative consequences down the road because we weren't careful with what the numbers are.
Exacerbate those problems.
And so I want to be certain, I don't want to assume, I want to be certain that that's how they
If
are,
it's not this year's budget, that number needs to include.
an inflationary.
And so in the capital plan, it does, but it is a guess on what that inflation
Right.
rate
Sure,
will be.
but if
Yes.
current inflation rates are 10% and you have it forecasted at a 2% inflation,
Yeah,
that's not helpful either. And if it slows down,
And you
you
adjust.
revise it, right? But
So typically what happens as you're bringing it into that biennium, you're gonna do a true up, so it's been in year 3. You're bringing it in, you're gonna adopt, you need to then go through, relook at those estimates, true them up, and they may move a little bit, but their order of magnitude, it's not gonna go from a 1.1 million to a $10 million project, right? It might go to 1.5, but you're
I'm
gonna
not
true it up.
suggesting, but if we've got $4 million in projects, a 10% difference is almost $500,000.
Correct.
Those are significant budgetary impacts. And I think so often in the past, and this is not necessarily, not to lay blame on anyone here or point anybody out, that the circumstances of the past have often been, you make a decision today, we'll just we'll figure that out in the future. And now we're left holding the bag on 7 or 8 different funds and all these, I mean,
And part of what we're hearing is,
Yeah.
well, we didn't account for the inflation.
for X or this or Y or inflation, or we didn't have, capital improvements in our analysis and I mean, that kind of stuff is just,
So
I think if we had that information and it was at least relatively accurate, relative being a very relative term, it could have led to us making different decisions at the time we were asked to make the decision.
understood, and that's what our hope is here by doing a plan, so you're looking into the future instead of at that moment. One of the things that we're gonna have to do is we have to, this is probably not a realistic number, so Alan, I think, told him you have 6 million and we went, that and I also wanna get to this is, what you're seeing, why you get a 9 there is because we're inflating it by 1%. Cause nobody's budgeting 3 years out that we're gonna spend 9, million and $9, right? We're just not getting there, but
Totally get it, Nathan, I'm not
So-
trying to ask you to defend it, I'm just saying, when you guys are presenting stuff to us, please ensure that it includes at least some kind of reasonable inflationary numbers when you're projecting out into the future.
so that's in the modeling, that's what we're trying to do, and I think these will adjust. One of the things we can do is so typically, once you get into a good process with the capital, council touches that, once a year, they look at it and say, yeah, that's still good, and you move on. Because this is new, we probably need to bring that to you, not for 24, but as we look into 25, there'll be some of those projects in 24 that maybe we're not gonna fund because of our projected
Well,
deficit, so you can give us, which are your top priorities? Cause right now, all these projects, I don't know, I know where
Just
some
let
came
me-
from, but I
just
don't know
let me
where the
stop you
others
real
came
quick, cause I'm gonna, there's a discussion, the city council is responsible for the budget.
Correct.
It's our vote, it's our decision. I have felt for a number of years that our votes have really been based on very inaccurate or sometimes meaningless information. And that concerns me, that I have voted. I don't feel like I've been manipulated to vote in certain ways, and that just really upsets me. I don't wanna get emotional about past things and bring that into the discussion tonight. But getting specific about capital improvement forecasts, I mean, if our budget is that screwed, we may not authorize a single capital project for the next 12 months or 18 months. We might pause everything. We might freeze all hiring. We might freeze all wages. We might do crazy stuff. And I'm not saying that to scare anybody or upset anybody. But if we're talking about raising taxes on the residents of Harriman for anything, you gotta be damn well understanding we are not going to be doing that without holding every single person's feet to the fire on every expense and every decision that we make along the way. That is, we are not gonna willy-nilly double people's taxes and then just assume that these numbers are okay. That's not gonna happen. And I apologize, I told myself I was not gonna get wound up about this, but, I mean, this is my taxes too. I pay into these funds, I pay into these plans, and if my money's not being used right, it pisses me off. And I can just imagine there's 60,000 other people who are pissed off about it too. So, although I appreciate the information and listing these things out and stuff, we have philosophical discussions that we have to have on a bigger scale before we're drilling down to these kind of decisions right now.
And that's where I'm trying to get. This was built based on these things, based on, you all didn't come in and say this was your top priority of this. I certainly heard on some streets that these were your priorities. But as these went in, even in our capital, there's a priority plan, but it's really, it's an engineering number that comes up. Council has not had as much say in this, and I said, once you have a plan that it's been in place a few years and you feel comfortable with it, council's touch on it is fairly light, right? They look at it, yep, these projects here's still the priorities we have, right? They don't spend, we probably need to spend more time at this point with you going through and saying, when we're looking at these priorities, where does this one fit versus this one, versus this one, versus this, so that you can have that say and say, as a council, you're directing, we have X amount of dollars. We're gonna try and give you a projection of what we think you will have. But you have to ultimately decide where you spend, because you could say, freeze it all and throw it all down here. Okay, it's ultimately yours, but it's like, we jumped on a treadmill, all those, you've been like, you jumped on a treadmill, it's already spinning. We're trying to do that and create some long-term planning, so you have some say on those, at the same time we're running and sprinting. So, your points are well received, actually, I'm a taxpayer here too, so I wanna make sure that we're using this correctly. This is just the general fund, I didn't bring you up some of the other funds, so water and police are more structural in their problems. The general fund is rose-colored glasses on how much revenue we would have for projects. We need to dial that back and bring those to you so you can tell us, here are the top ones we want to fund, here are the ones we're not going to, or we're going to push out.
And the reason I say it from a philosophical standpoint is, if we have budget shortfalls that are already being supplemented by the general fund, we as a council have to decide, is it better to, can we cut costs somehow? Can we delay projects? Can we eliminate projects? Can we cut projects out of the general fund and use it to supplement another fund so we don't have to raise taxes quite as much or quite as fast? Or, these are complicated, big time decisions, and you can't just make this decision without it impacting 10 other things,
Yeah,
right?
So here's the thing, I agree 100% with everything that Steve has said, and then maybe where some of the frustration that comes through, I'm doing my best, I'm glad you went first. Right, my wife got an earful the last couple of days as I'm going through all of this.
Where's your Post-it note?
I looked at it before
Okay.
we started, I really did. I've been trying to do the Zen thing all day long and just be calm, stick to your notes. But there's a couple things going on. When I say Groundhog Day about this stuff, it really is, right? Making decisions in a vacuum. Well, here's this fund, and what do you wanna do with these things? Well, it's not just these things, because what we're finding out is that these things are being affected by the structural issues in other budgets.
Correct.
So you can't put this in front of us and say, what are your priorities and what do you want done, if we don't even know what we have to work with, because those other issues are stealing from them, right? So, and this is what happens every year, is we say, well, these are our priorities, okay, we'll put those on the list and we'll go working on those. And then we get through the year towards the end and, oh my gosh, well, we have to pay for these structural
Right.
problems that haven't ever been fixed, and now we don't have the money for those, and there's something else came up, and we need you to make a decision right now,
Oh, by the way,
on this thing that
the budget has to
done.
be turned in tonight by legislative decree, and so make your decision.
So,
Surprise.
correct me if I'm wrong, your comment about we may not do anything, right? And that's, I think I made the comment to you the other day about, some don't like this word, but look, if you're putting it on us to fix it, austerity is the word. No more anything, no more hiring, freeze on all capital projects, and fix the structural budget. Put these processes in place and bring us some decisions that we can make. That's my frustration. Now I'm gonna go kind of a step further. Is that fair, what I just said?
Yeah, let's just put it this way. I don't know if or what any of those decisions might be. I put out extreme measures because at this point, I feel like I'm grasping at straws a little bit, right?
I'm
I
not-
don't know what to do.
We're not
There were
in the
some
weeds.
recommendations made. I didn't like those recommendations, frankly. I'm not happy with those numbers. And I think there's a lot of questions, a lot of alternatives that need to be analyzed, a lot of accountability that needs to be addressed, some detailed reporting that needs to be made to the council on some things. And then I think we might be in a better situation to determine, okay, from a high level, here's some things we wanna disagree on how we should make some decisions. And now let's apply some of those things to some of the decisions and start dialing it down.
What's
I
difficult?
anticipate inconsistencies and problems, but we'll get there. So I'm just saying, I'm not saying that we will do that, I'm just saying, I'm not taking anything off the table.
Yeah, and I'm kind of maybe taking that a step further, saying fundamentally, if you're, this is kind of what I feel like right now is, okay, we have some real problems with the budget, like all the way through. Some major ones in these three core areas, but they affect everything else, right? So there's really several core areas. These are the problems. Council, what do you wanna do? We can raise taxes and throw more money at it, and that will fix it for this year, maybe next year. But how do I know that the structural issues have been fixed? Sorry, but I've said before, with parts of the budget, I've done my due diligence, I've asked the questions, I've been given misinformation and manipulated into making decisions. how do I just give you more money without knowing that those problems have been fixed? Right? So if it's, here's the problems and we want more money to fix it, that answer I think is gonna be a resounding no. But if you're telling us, well, what do you want to do to fix it? Then you better be paying me to sit in your chair and do your job, right? We need to make decisions, but we need you to give us the information to make the decisions. And part of that is, okay, here's the problems, and here's a few different ways that we think we can do it. We can make these cuts, right-sized services. So a couple notes that I wrote down. Inflation is inflation. These problems are not all inflation.
Correct.
Big structural issues, big systemic issues in the way budgets are done and the planning. So you need to show us how we're gonna fix those systemic planning issues so that it doesn't happen again.
If I make a comment while I derail your note thinking there, I wanna interject something specific that I think would be a good example here. Let's say, for example, let's go into the, I don't even remember, stormwater, where we said when the fund was originally set up, it didn't anticipate or calculate into the fund number money used for future capital projects.
That would be storm.
For a storm drain. My understanding is that we outsource to experts to do studies, to analyze things, to, engineering people, whatever, to help us put these plans together, and somebody missed that? My question would be, how did it get missed? Who missed it? If it's a company that we hired that didn't look over, are they still doing business with the city, and if so, why? And why haven't they been replaced and held accountable for these
Was
mistakes?
that a one-time thing? Is it an every year thing, and how many years has it been happening? And
So when I say that we need some accountability on things, is that I need to know where the problems stem from and how we're gonna fix those problems at a root. So I think what Jared's talking about, from a systemic or a structural issue, so that we can go forward and say, okay, whatever the problem is now understood, addressed, fixed, and taken care of, and will not be repeated. Now we know what the exact issue is and why, and we can start making decisions about how to address that. But until I know what is actually fundamentally the problem and if it's being addressed and corrected, I feel like I'm just putting, Band-Aids on Jell-O. It's like so squishy and meaningless, it doesn't accomplish anything. And if we're doing that on the backs of the taxpayers, that's what really frustrates me.
yeah, so I think that there's a couple, I always think, so I'm looking at this going, all right, so what are the issues, right? Identify them. Why are they, how did they happen, right? Can we correct how they happen so they don't happen again? That's the systemic part, right? The flaw in the process. So the real example is several times in the presentation last week, it was noted that there is miscommunication between departments and finance, Alan, in number of people. He thought it was this number, they thought it was that number, we ended up with more people than we budgeted for, right? So how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? Tell me how that process is corrected so that doesn't happen. Right? That's the
You
first
identified
part.
a problem, we don't have any solutions for some of those
I
problems.
used this example earlier today. You guys remember the movie Tommy Boy? Right? He's in the elevator with the big auto parts guy. He's like, what is that smell? He's like, oh, it's a car pine fresh air freshener thing. Right, I showered in the car with it, whatever. He's like, well, you've identified the problem. The next step is to do something about it. Right, and he leaves. And I feel like it's not to get another air freshener and try that one, right? And just put more on, right? Stop what you're doing. Let's go back a step and make sure we don't make that problem worse going forward,
New level.
right?
Yeah, we got a new level.
I know you like my examples, right? I spend all day trying to explain complex financial things to regular people. But to me, that's really what it is, right? And that's what I mean by, what's been proposed is give us more money, right? And I know that there's more behind it, but
So
Well,
I
well,
don't, we didn't propose that. We gave you those numbers so you would understand what that would take. So if you see that one, you'd have to do 173%.
not gonna
That was
happen
not necessarily,
ever in any
No,
more.
that
We wanted
wasn't, that
you-
wasn't a staff proposal, that
we
was.
wanted you to see the magnitude.
I get it, but if anybody's
that.
thinking that we're just gonna increase taxes and get more money to throw at the problem, not gonna happen, right? So at least what I'm saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, what you're trying to say is, look, there's the old saying, you need to inspect what you expect, right? Well, we've done a certain bit, at least I feel I've done a good amount of inspection and asked the right questions and pushed back on things. I mean, given incorrect information or misleading information, and now here we are. So I have to inspect a step further and say, prove to me that this isn't gonna happen anymore. Tell me what has been fixed structurally so that that doesn't happen. And that's just that example. That's a major thing is the personnel.
To be fair, some of this is preaching to the choir, right? These are not necessarily the results of decisions of people that are in this room. And I'm going to leave it at that, but
Yeah.
we're not
Not
we're
looking
not
to
casting
tell-
aspersions, we're not throwing blame on anybody, I think it's important to recognize that we're talking about problems, not people, okay?
And
We're
we
talking
need to-
about issues, not past decisions that were made. We're talking about how do we fix real problems now, okay?
things were done a certain way. And I mean, if you wanna talk people, those people are gone and we need to change what we're doing. We need to identify what needs to be changed and make sure it gets changed. So to me, that's the first thing is tell me what those systemic planning structural issues are and what's been changed so that that's not gonna happen again because it continues to. And then second is, okay, there is this deficit. We have fixed that problem, so we're not going to exacerbate it. Here are some potential solutions, right? So 500,000, $1 million, those are today's dollars, but are those recurring things that we need to add an inflation factor to in coming years? If it's people and wages, et cetera, absolutely, right? So we've identified that discrete number for this year. When we talk about tax increases, I think we're all agreed that inflation is reality and property taxes do not automatically inflate, they do not automatically increase with the price of your home, with the value of your home, that's not how it works. In my opinion, that's a good thing, it shouldn't work like that. If it were automatic, we'd be in super big trouble because government would spend way too much money, it would never keep up, it would be completely inflated. I won't bore you with it tonight, but I did a little homework. I'm that guy that keeps everything. I have every tax increase notice from the time we moved into Harrisburg, from '09 to now. I wanna know what my property tax was, so keep in mind that your property tax percentage dollar amount does not go up with the value of your home. 2009, wanna know what my property tax was?
$1,000, $1,500,
3,000.
you know.
3,140.54.
I verify that is correct.
2022, take a guess. I've said it before, anybody around?
$6,000.
$7,274. Now tell me that's inflation. Including the last 2 years, average inflation over that same amount, this is what I do for a living, average inflation over that same period of time, 2%. If you add in the last 2 years, it's 3% average. That's an average of 8% per year increase. That's, right? So inflation is, and we can go more into inflation. Inflation is one thing, but there are some structural systemic issues that we need to fix. So just to further that example, so then how do we fix that part? So if part of that structural issue is that we've hired more people than we had budgeted for, then we don't hire those people for this year and maybe next year to right size to what we had actually budgeted for. Right?
And we're already ahead of budget then, yeah.
Yeah. Right, so cause and effect sort of thing. And then the third, and save inflation for another day. There's two parts to inflation, right? And we talk about in government a lot, done it with UPD, Slovisa, with city, with UFA, it's the school districts, it's the same thing, right? Especially when we're talking about public versus private, right? We always talk about public trying to compete with private. you can't. They're different animals. You're not comparing apples and apples, right? It's apples and oranges at best, right? So there's two parts to that inflation. We're gonna talk about wages, et cetera. And I just wanna make this structural point, right? So first thing, budget-wise, show me a plan that identifies those two things, right? And then the third part, yeah, inflation is a thing and we need to do something about that. But I'm not gonna vote to increase anything by any amount until the structural problems are addressed, right? Then we can isolate the inflation and say, this is what that really is, and they're two different plans. There's two parts to inflation. One is the cost of just regular goods and services, right? And the other is, I would say, is wages and benefits. They really are two different things, right? So cost of, I actually have charts I show my clients every day, right? Inflation, that average over time is fairly steady because it's an average. But for goods and services, so yeah, I feel so old going back to conversation before the meeting started. As in high school, gas was 75 cents $1 a gallon. I remember my dad telling me it was a nickel or whatever, right? I mean, 75 cents a gallon. It's the same gallon of gas now. It's the same stinking thing, and it's $4. Well, it's just because there's more money in the system. There's more money chasing the same amount or fewer goods. It's a supply and demand. This is just economics, right? So, and problem over the last several years is we've pumped way too much money into the system. Interest rates to zero, increases the amount of money in the system exponentially. They kept it there way too long. We're paying people not to work, all those sorts of things, right? That's goods and services, cost of stuff goes up. Wages and salaries, that's part of it. But the bigger part, especially when we're talking about public service, and I'll pick on the police department and fire, public safety in particular, what we've been involved in lately, but it's the same thing for regular government employees, school district employees, right? Is you are competing somewhat with the private sector, but it's not apples and apples. Higher wages, lower benefits, right? Stability, instability. My daughter works in construction. I've told her you need a different job because you're gonna get laid off. The second the market drops, you're gonna get laid off. You don't have to worry about that in these other areas, right? Pensions. My clients that retire on time, I'd say on time when they're supposed to, they have pensions. 90% of the clients I work with that actually retire and have money to work with are government employees because they have pensions. The guys getting paid $10,000 or $20,000 more don't have pensions. They don't have retirement savings. They're not retiring in their 60s. A lot of times early 70s, and they're still working. Right? I mean, there are different things, but do you lose people chasing that dollar? For sure you do. So that's another conversation. But the issue with competing for policemen or fire or an engineer with another city, right? If we're comparing like and like, so I'll look to Chief, tell me if I'm way off base here, but for police in particular, our department is pretty well fully staffed. How many other departments, even in Salt Lake Valley, would you say are fully staffed? Like they aren't chasing people?
Maybe a couple more of the 17, maybe
Most,
13 aren't.
and I don't know the answers to these, I really am asking. So of those that aren't fully staffed, like how many are they short on
Usually about
average?
10%.
10%, so if they've got, I don't know.
Well, I mean, you look at like Salt Lake City, 500 officers, it's not unusual for them to be 50 to 60 behind, or open allocation.
So they're wanting to hire 50, 60 people.
They've been as high as 90 last year, I think.
Crazy numbers. I mean, an apartment with 20 officers, they've always got two that they're trying to hire, right? We're lucky we have a great department built the right way, and we're not necessarily chasing people. We're keeping good people. There are other things that can keep them here. Talk about all those things. But what we're competing against is, say, Salt Lake City that has 50 people that they're trying to hire. They budgeted for those extra 50 people. They don't have them. So what are they doing with that money?
Well,
Cannibalize it to.
Go ahead.
they use it to increase their wages.
Yeah.
And so they try and meet their market demand, right, separate from growth and inflation.
The
with an
supply
open
of
allocation.
qualified candidates is finite. It's still the same.
But they collect their open allocations and convert that to market adjustment. It's typically what happens, and we did that at UPD all the time. And at UPD we ran, well, we were running, there was 500 people there, we'd run about 60 to 80 people short. all the
Right, and
time.
so-
Most of them were in Harriman, as it turned out.
So where I'm going with this is that there is actual goods and services inflation, and then there's supply and demand for a qualified workforce. And you have agencies like that that aren't running as efficiently or as well, or have the culture, or they're not the right area, or whatever. We're fortunate that we're not chasing people all the time. I mean, we continue, correct me if I'm wrong, but last I heard, we continue to have more applicants for positions than we have open. That's not the case in those other areas, but they have that budget for those extra 50 people that they can't hire, so they're shifting that money towards the others to try to keep their people here and attract a handful of the 50 open slots, right? And then we're trying to compete with their inflated amounts to compensate our people fairly and keep them here. At some point, in an open market, there's an equilibrium. At some point, like, we cannot sustainably keep at the level that they're chasing. We don't have the resources. We just don't.
We call it the race to the bottom, right?
That's exactly what Chief and I have talked about. It's a race to the bottom. If we try to do that at some point, we will lose people because we won't be able to pay enough of them, right? So if that's the game that we're in, whether it's police, fire, or rank file staff, whatever your position is, at some point, great, the people who are here will get paid more, but there will be fewer of you. Like, that's the reality. Like, we will never be able
Right, if you
to
guys,
keep chasing
if
that.
if we have, for example, if you have a staff of 20 and you need a 10% pay raise, but the budget's in there, you got a staff to 18 and you get a 10% pay raise.
And it, I know might sound terrible to me to say this, but just comparing, if it's just us in Salt Lake City, right, just to take those two, there's nobody else, there's a finite supply of qualified individuals, and they have 50 open allocations. They can shove that money towards the top and hire 10 of them, and 5 of them might come from us, 5 of them might come from our state, and there's nothing we can do about it, because we don't have that money to throw at the top, and we might end up with our 10% unallocated at some point, because that's the supply and demand in the market. So I'm not saying I want that to happen. We want to do everything we can to avoid that, but I want our expectations of compensation and benefits to be realistic. At some point in UFA, they talk about the top 3. It's aspirational. We're going to have this conversation a lot. This is starting next week. I'm going to mention it going towards next year's budget. That's aspirational. We want to be in the top 3 compensated. Well, that's not very realistic. It's aspirational. It's not realistic. And I think we've given them the expectation that it's realistic. It's not. That's not the tax base that we have, right? We need to be competitive, but there's no way we can tell people for sure we're going to pay you in the top 3, because there will be, if we do that, there will be fewer of you to do the job. That's what will happen.
If I could, real quick, and Nathan and I talk about this quite often. To say that you want to be in the top 3 or the top 3rd, while it's also unrealistic in a lot of cases, it also doesn't matter. Because if I have 17 agencies and I say I want to be competitive as a council, and I always shudder when council say we want to be top 3rd, I'm like, I don't say that. It really doesn't matter, because the spread differential on the wages earned is what matters. And we may be, and for instance, right now, we're 0.1% ahead of Salt Lake City in wages, but we can't be that forever, because their CBA says that they get to be. So
They have to be 1%. They have to
It's
be.
1% above.
They have to be 1% high.
So when these
above
agencies
everyone
adjust that, we shudder and go, don't do that, because that just launches a whole new market search for who's gonna be the top.
Because when we go up, they go up, and then
right.
we're falling
You
down,
can't
which makes
beat
us go up again. Yeah.
Right, and they're using money, Counselor Henderson, exactly right, they're using this open allocation money, which is, it seems like free money. Oh, we've got all this money that we've underspent, remember that term? So let's throw it at the wages, well, that's just certainly
Please
not
don't use
sustainable.
underspend.
But when you look at the
The problem is
spread,
they use money that way to
Don't say
inflate
that
wages. When they actually do fill those positions, they're gonna be at inflated wages, which just,
so of the
makes-
13 agencies that we looked at most recently, we were number 11. Now, that doesn't seem right. People go, oh, we're the 11th paid agency in the world, in Salt Lake County. That doesn't necessarily tell the story, because we're also a 10-step police agency, where others are 12. So the money my officers reach, and when we talk about lifetime earnings, my officers reach their top pay at 10 years, and the next agency not till 12. Well, the money they earn in between that takes that agency until they're 18-ish years to earn that same lifetime's earning. Does that make sense? So our officers are making their money ahead of the others. And the reason they expand that to 12 is just simply that scale, right? That now we can throw more money on a longer scale. Like, you're not gonna make as much as soon. Does that make sense?
And then that's the whole structure of the pay scale you
Yeah.
and I talked about. earlier of, there's a longevity piece too. I might, for the same position, I might make, a few dollars, say it's hourly, a few dollars more an hour over there, but I start at a lower rung on the seniority for promotions. I start at that level for the steps in pay, whatever you guys call it. The school district, it's steps, right?
That's
So,
what ours is, yeah.
I've got a brother that's still at UPD. 2 reasons that he says he's staying there. One, he likes that. Where he's at, there's more action. There's more urban. He doesn't want to sit in a suburban area and have it easier in his eyes. And second is that he would lose his years of seniority and
Right.
and how that works. So there's different things. We want to be competitive, but to think that we're going to be at the top and chase those that their situation's completely different. Completely different. So I mean, their agreement with the union is they have to be 1% higher than everyone else,
And they
Have to.
adjust that twice a year.
right? Second is 50 open police officers. I mean, the average, if you're at the bottom, the average for us to hire someone, compensation, benefits, equipment, et cetera, 150. If they're anywhere off the bottom, we're somewhere between the 150 and 200,
Yeah.
right? Average to hire one person, so times that by 50. That's their budget they have to work with to try to recruit people, right? Like, we can't really compete with that. What we can compete with is the structure and how we do things, our environment, those things, and be competitive enough that people wanna be here.
Now, I will say this about that, West Valley pays about $3 more an hour than we do, and Draper pays about $3 less, so that tells you we're right in that 50. Even though we're 11, we're right, if you scatter it, we're right.
It's a pretty tight.
Yeah, it's pretty tight, and our scale's, shorter, which is better. However, if we get to a point where we're $3 behind, obviously that's going to, goodwill
That's why
only
you
goes
make-
so far from Troy, right?
Yeah,
Hey
make
guys,
adjustments.
just work for me because you really like me. When you're talking 20% difference, then that becomes an issue, right? And we need to
So where I'm
change
going with this is this isn't just police and fire, this is, how many employees does the city have? A couple hundred? Same thing. I can't tell you how many times I sat in this room and other rooms and had the conversation of, well, we gotta pay more, we're gonna lose this person to South Jordan or lose them to there. Well, are we doing our job? Do we have it structured properly? Are we competitive? Right? There's no way we're gonna keep every good person. Part of the meeting yesterday was, we wanna create a new position to reward these people, and I think there's a little pushback in some of our conversation afterwards was, we wanna keep good talented people, but if we don't have a position for them, so if Wendy wants
Pick on
to,
me.
if Wendy wants to be a city manager, and she's qualified to, and she's fantastic, and we wanna keep her here, do we have the budget to pay the equivalent of 2 city managers, cause we don't wanna lose Wendy? Or do we say, fantastic, you've got an opportunity to go to the city and to another city and have that position that you're fully qualified for and make a bunch of more money? Or is she content to sit here and wait for him to leave to take his job, cause she wants that, right? Because of the environment and the culture.
I don't think she wants, she wants that job.
So my reason in stating that example is, going back to, I keep looking at Chief Whittison, is that that position is those, we're talking about PIOs. Are we creating a position to reward someone, to try to keep them here? And eventually you can't if they're qualified and they want to move up, right? But if they're doing a good job of what they do and we can do market adjustments and make sure we're competitive and it's the right environment, you're not gonna lose people. It's not 100% about wages, but we are competing for a limited supply of qualified individuals, no matter what the position is.
Yeah, Jared, I think you make a good point. We have limited resources. There's X amount of resources that are available.
We can't keep,
And we can't just say, oh, well, X isn't enough, we'll just go X plus, and we'll just add money and then everything will be okay. That's not a solution that's sustainable, nor does it actually solve the problem.
my ultimate point is raising taxes to chase that scenario isn't going, like, it can't happen, it can't work. There's only so much inflationary tax rate we do. 40% increase, I don't know anyone, myself, any of my clients, I do personal financial planning, I know everything about them. I don't know anyone that's seen a 40% increase in their wages the last 4 or 5 years, right? Like, it's an interesting moment in time, but that's the dynamic at work. That's not an inflationary, just an inflationary thing, that's supply and demand of qualified people. Right, so let's separate inflation, right, and the demand for qualified people. Those are kind of two things in that inflationary thing, and then the actual budget issues. What are the systemic problems, right? Identify them. How are we gonna fix them so they don't happen? Put the shovel down. Right?
Quit digging.
Prove to me that that's the case before we talk about inflation and increasing taxes and throwing more money at it. And then if there is a $500,000 deficit in this budget, $1 million in that budget, 50,000 in this budget, stemming from those things, then tell me how you're going to fix those things in the next year, 2, 3, to right size that, right? And that helps this plan going forward. And if that means that we need to utilize some general funds to help right size these things and get through those few years, then that's a decision that we can make on this. But until you show me that we have that solution for the police budget, we have that solution for water, for storm, whatever those are, I can't look at a capital projects list and tell you what's most important and weigh truly what we can and can't do, et cetera. Does that make sense?
Just so I'm clear, then you are okay with us proposing the general fund, skipping some of these things to subsidize the other funds?
Not necessarily, I'm saying
I'm just, cause what you're asking
let's
is
put
to
it-
give you some systematic and then some
Let me get-
solutions, I wanna know what the parameters are.
Let me clarify, because I think we're saying, let's say that the reason there's a shortage in this is because we hired too many people, right? But in this year, the budget would have hired those people, so 2 years or 3 years from now, it'll be okay. How do we bridge the gap between here and there, right? If we can bridge that gap, maybe with general fund, you don't have to raise taxes. You just don't hire the people that you don't hire anymore until you get up to where the budget covers the people that you already have. And
And then
that's,
how many years
Right.
of savings do we replenish the general fund to make up for what we borrowed from it?
Yeah.
If you're gonna dip into general fund, that's what that means, is you're gonna pay it back by doing without for a few years to pay it back.
Right. And that's the,
Cause that's, I mean, that's structural, that's not inflation.
and so, in answer to your question, yes, under the right circumstances, I could make a case that we should use general fund to bridge a gap. It may not be enough. I'm not saying we shouldn't, we're not going to vote to raise taxes. We may have to. That might be the right solution. But an inflationary tax adjustment to adjust for, costs and hard costs and even maybe some personnel inflation and market conditions, that's a reasonable thing. We can make that case to the taxpayers pretty easily, and it's, a fact of life. It's not great, but it's a fact of life, and that's a reasonable thing, and I think that that's why our tax system is set up the way it is. We have those truth in taxation, we hear from the residents, we explain what the issues are, and we make a decision. What I'm not comfortable with is saying, hey, we're out over our skis, we really don't have a good solution, we haven't really fixed the problem, and it's a 40% gap, so let's raise taxes 40% to close the gap, and then we don't have to worry about it. I think that's what we're opposed to.
And I will say, we wanted to show you what those tax increases were from us.
Totally understand.
Because we did have people approach us, what would it take?
And so,
Here's your scale.
and so the
Right.
next part of that is my comment about identify those things, what are those solutions, and then what's your proposed plan? If you're just asking us, right now, this is kinda how it feels for us. Here's all the problems. What do you guys wanna do about it?
So it shouldn't be that way. What we did last time, we gave you a bunch of information. We wanted you to come back with questions like you're doing now, so we know where to focus our responses. I mean, we've been talking, we've already put in some hiring freezes and doing some other things and telling people, don't spend stupid at the end of the year kind of things. So we're working kind of internally, cause that's what we're paid to do, is figure out how to do that. The process, instead of, so this is a little different in that there's already a budget for 2024 adopted. We think the assumptions for it, it's going to need to be amended. you don't have to do that before July 1, so we have some time, so we're trying to, in a perfect world for next year, when we're doing it by then, we would have these conversations earlier in the year, so you can give us direction as if we're running into problems, or we can tell you, here's how we're looking at this, are we on the right track? So this wasn't a tell us the solutions, I needed to know what your specific questions were. So I don't wanna go spend a bunch of time solving this and find out, no, you were fine doing this other thing.
I wanna say that I think in general, and I, as much as we express frustration, right, and Jared and I are probably the kings of bombast around here, right, like, I get it. But when it comes to, our city and its operations, Jared and I had this conversation earlier today, I think we both generally agree, we operate pretty lean. There's not a lot of fluff, there's not a lot of waste in our city. I don't think our residents need to feel like, oh, they're just spending money willy-nilly, and that's not the case. I think we're a responsibly managed organization in terms of how we use taxpayer dollars. That being said, I would issue the challenge of, can we do better? Are all of the assumptions, I went on a deep dive for a while today on fleet management. Calculating, depreciation versus cost of, M&R going up and where they intersect and how many years that is and blah, blah, blah. I mean, this whole thing. I downloaded documents, from the federal government about what their, 4x4 truck of this weight class should equal this many miles or this many years, and if it's in this weight class, it's longer, and if it's diesel, it's this, and if it's hybrid, it's this. And so I've got all this information saying, it just is one of those things where I'm like, okay, we're talking about replacing trucks at 60,000 miles. How can we make them go to 80 or 100 or 120? Is that change our assumptions about things? Would we have to have different warranty things? Would it require different maintenance schedules? Would it yeah, those are hard, complicated questions to ask, how do you fix all of that stuff? But I guess I would issue the challenge, we need to review all of those assumptions. And that's just an easy picking one, right? Like fleet management. There's a lot of money goes out to the fleet. I'm not saying we're doing anything wrong, and I'm not saying that the model we have right now isn't absolutely the best model. I just think we need to challenge that on a regular basis. Why is this the best model? Are we sure this is? How are we calculating these numbers? Are our assumptions different? I mean, if you were dealing with, a 4x4 truck in the 1980s, that's a lot different than a brand new truck. Maintenance schedules are different. Cost of maintenance are different. Expectations on the longevity of the engines are different. And so maybe our assumptions need to be different. So I would just use that kind of an example just across the board.
Well, I
Right?
think that speaks to something.
Can we
talked
find
about
ways to save
before,
money?
Which is, this shows that we need to do some things differently. If the answer of why we're doing it this way is because that's the way we've always done it, that needs to be changed, right? There are better ways to do things all the time. I'm not saying change things for the sake of change, but Sherry and I were talking about, just one example was the Butterfield cleanup, whatever, right? So what did it cost us to do that? It's a great program, and there's definitely a benefit to it, but what did it cost us, and is there a better way to do it? Instead of paying people to sit out there all day, for that day, do we instead promote spring cleanup and provide vouchers for people to take their stuff to the dump? If it's an appliance and it costs extra, do we give them a voucher for that? And it ends up, is the cost for that gonna be substantially less than paying people to sit out there all day? And then we save the cost of what the job they were putting off, right? That's costing us money sitting there. And so I told her, I'm like, well, on my end of town, it's pointless for me to drive over to Butterfield, load stuff up, drive it
Hey,
over to
closer to the
Butterfield
dump.
Park. We can all just go to the dump, but you're telling people it's free over here, and they don't know that it could be free over there. Right? Are there things that we can do better and save money? If it means we save $25,000 a year, let's save $25,000 a year, because that's just off the top that you're calculating. Then we're putting those people to work where they have work to do that's costing us money while it's not being done, right? So I think we go through a bunch of examples, but that's what we want you guys to do. If there's $1 million deficit here, 500 here, if it's 50,000 here, 100 there, and if there are large things that are kind of insurmountable, then that's where we have to look at bigger things to do, or are there programs and things we're doing that are kind of extra, costing a lot of money? Sorry, I pick on events all the time, but if we're spending $1 million a year on events and we have a $500,000 shortage for police, put that to a vote with the residents. I think it's a pretty easy win, right? Do we scale back on events and have more officers for public safety, or do we have 10 more events a year? Right? Let's kind of weigh a few things. The conversations we've had about our strategic plan and our core competencies. What are the core things we're supposed to provide? Water, streets, parks, public safety. Right? If those are the things that are hurting and we have all this money over here, that those other things
I would
are
submit
important.
that I think that part,
Can we do them better and
yeah,
shift
I
money?
think there's a
I'm
way
not
that
saying
we should
not
say
do
that,
things.
that people also want a sense of community, right? That's a part of why they
I'm
form
not
the
saying get rid
city
of
and have that
things,
identity,
right?
right?
But but if that's the hard
Right.
and fast
If
choice.
we're talking about not hiring a police officer, we should also be talking about everything, right? I mean, if once we get to that kind of a decision, that it's impacting potentially the staffing and wages of public safety, if we have to make that kind of a decision, we have to understand everything has to be scrutinized through the whole city, right? Every decision has to be made. As soon as there's even a hint that there would be a compromise in a court, like water quality or public safety or something like that, everything else has to be challenged.
So may I ask a clarifying?
Yeah.
Because you've talked about right sizing and all that. If we choose to not hire, so not, I understand if somebody leaves and you say, okay, we're not gonna replace them, that's one conversation versus hiring new ones. Because I've heard you say earlier, and I wanna make sure now that you've just said that, we have a staffing plan for the PD, which I think is fairly aggressive, growth-wise. Given our revenues, frankly, given our crime rate, it's pretty aggressive. We cannot, but I look at the statistics.
I think that's separate
So is that
conversation.
it? So, but again, you just
So-
said, if we're not gonna hire police, then I've gotta go cut a bunch of, I just need to
No,
know
no,
what.
that's
you're
what I'm
doing.
saying
No,
is-
no.
An aggressive forecast plan is different than what's needed to provide
Okay,
a
I
certain level of
just,
service, right?
okay.
What I'm
saying
talking
we're
about is,
short
when all of a
this.
sudden, we've got $1 million shortage to be able to pay the officers we already have, that's what I'm talking about.
Right.
Not necessarily, are we gonna hire 4 officers or 2 officers? That's a philosophical
I just
debate,
wanted to
right?
make sure, because when I was here, I wanna,
Yeah.
because I've got staff here, I'm gonna go tell them one thing, I don't want them to say,
No,
well, I heard
exactly.
council say something.
If you're saying, so the reason I'm pulling that is if you're saying there's a deficit, we don't have money to pay for what we're currently doing, that's completely different than saying we wanna hire people. Two different things. On that front, and I know we're out of time, but on that front, if the model that we're trying to hire to, whether it's police or any other department in the city, is too aggressive, right? So we've been in this hyper growth mode for 10 years, right? I mean, unreal growth, and the way the budget has been done has been, like you said earlier, we'll figure it out later, cause we'll have more money next year, and we'll figure it out and move things around. That's not the case anymore. It's not going to be the case again, right? The projection, like, we know what our boundary is, we know what the numbers are, should be able to do some good math and know what that finite number is and what our service level to that is. So I just know police numbers the best. I've been through the public safety stuff better, so this isn't picking on police, this goes for water, this goes for parks, this goes for every department that we have. If the budget was 5 million and the new growth has been 2 million, we should be hiring to that number, not our aspirational service level. Does that answer your question?
The only thing I would say is if budget plus growth is providing an unacceptable level of service, that's something you gotta bring to the council and say, hey, we've got a shortage. Then we make those kinds of decisions, right? Not to beat this dead horse again, but I think the issue is, in some of these things, it feels like we've gotten out ahead of what our budget is. And I don't think that's an appropriate statement. You know, we've hired more people than we actually have money to pay for. So we need to figure out systemically, how can we fix that? It's really hard to say, well, we should just lay some people off and get back to where we are. That's not great. I mean, these are people's lives and
Well,
like,
I mean,
that's not a great solution.
to be
I'm
fair-
not saying it's totally off the table, but that's not a very good solution.
let's be
Or saying we
realistic.
should raise taxes automatically to bring it up, that's not a great solution. There's gotta be somewhere where we say, okay, we're 3 people ahead of where we should be. That's 1 person for 3 years. We don't hire 1 person for 3 years, the budget catches up and it's fine. It's okay, we close the hole. Let's figure out how we manage that hole for the couple of years that we need to, and maybe that means we delay a traffic project for 3 years.
And I don't want to, kind of 2 things. I'll stick with the one. Real quick, on that note, and I don't wanna say that anyone is not overworked, but we all are. I've never heard of a school teacher saying that they aren't paid enough, or that they're overworked and they need help. They need more aides, they need more people in that department. Whatever your profession is, I don't know of a single person that says, I don't need any help whatsoever. I'm totally compensated, we're fine, right? Everyone, there's always more work to do, there's always those pains that happen. If we wanna compare to the private sector, the way this goes in the private sector, we're not having this conversation. Like, we would have already failed, they've hired a consultant, and they come in and tell you what you're gonna cut and who gets fired. Like that, it's not we're gonna keep people and we'll catch up in a few years, like we just said, which is more what we want to see. It's, you don't have money for it this year, you get rid of these people and maybe you can hire a couple more in 5 years.
Cut your workforce by 10%.
Like that's the
You're
difference.
10% over budget?
Right?
Yeah.
So again, I don't wanna say that we don't need more people, right? But we have to be, my quip the other night about, my wife says we need a housekeeper every year. Well, our budget is this, right? And yep, there's total justification for having that. But our kids are a disaster, the dogs are a disaster, I've been laid up for several months, she's working full-time, like, there's plenty of reason that we should have it, but we only have this much money. Like we're gonna have to do some extra work and do without it for a little while, right? So, that's my last example for you, story time.
So I think,
Nathan, do you have what you?
well, it's discuss the structural issues, how we got there, how they're fixed, how they don't repeat, what our solutions are going forward. And I think I've understood at least what the 3 of you are talking about on how we start to prioritize that. So that's really what the intent of tonight. I think in the past, it's given it to solve this, adopt it tonight. You've seen the numbers,
It's a
you've had a
better
chance to
process,
think.
Maybe we
Let
have
us step
PTSD
back.
from that being the case.
I didn't even get it last time you adopted it. I had to go ask for it the next day. So, we'll work on bringing you something back that starts to outline that. Like I said, we have a model that you can, but it's brute force right now. Eventually it'll be more, live where we could sit there and say, well, if you didn't hire this person, what does that do? But right now it requires Kyle to do a bunch of work and then I do a bunch of work and then we try and make sure that they line up because they don't talk to each other.
I don't think we have anything else to do, so.
This will be what we're focused on, so.
And just to reiterate, we have an approved budget, so really the only deadline we have is, we have to make a decision on property tax by June 22nd. But we can do the budget amendment anytime because we have an approved budget already, so
So
there's
we'll
not
work,
that crunch.
yeah, we'll work through this and be bringing you back some ideas.
And that's a
on
huge
that.
step, having the 2-year thing, right?
Right.
Because that's what it has been, and that's the PTSD is, we only have 60 days to do this.
So that it's gonna feel like Groundhog's Day, cause we'll start talking about these next budgets much earlier. And so you think, didn't we just have this conversation? And the answer would be yes, you did. So hopefully a little bit different structure.
Motion to temporarily recess work meeting to go into general session.
Second.